Hello everyone, this is Kat. Welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the reading of a one-shot entitled Breathless in a Crowd. Here's the summary. Midori Izuku has had bad experiences with class trips. It's a shock when, despite having a quirk in friends, he's left alone once more in a bustling crowd. He does not handle it well. But hey, at least there's this really nice person who saw him panicking and is letting him cry into their shirt. Oh, that's Shigaraki Tomura, isn't it? Izuku watched his classmates vanish into the crowd, leaving him alone on his first class trip. Classic bullying technique, yet Kachan hadn't even been the one to organize it. Then again, Kachan never had bothered to play with his feelings. It was something he could respect of his ex-childhood friend. He was far too dedicated to frontal attacks to plan humiliation too carefully. Oh, he was sure that 1A hadn't meant to do it. They were all nice kids. They didn't know that he was quirkless after all. That didn't help the tightness in his chest, the shake of his legs, and the way that his vision had blurred with the bright colors of the crowd around him. It wasn't fair. Even Uraraka had left him, the one person he thought may actually like him, but no, she too had run away from him at first opportunity. Izuku didn't even really need to buy anything. He just didn't want to fall behind and get left out of the friend groups. It was so goddamn hard to keep up with teenage friendships. He knew how fickle people were. Had heard plenty of gossip in middle school about the practice of dumping friends just because they kept turning down invites to hang out, so he had come to the mall, expecting to be slightly uncomfortable the entire time, but otherwise okay if he could use Uraraka and his other budding friends as shields to the crowd. No, that was not what had happened. Izuku was alone. Izuku was in the mall. Izuku was in a crowd of people after clearly being abandoned. Izuku could not breathe. He was barely aware of the world around him, felt people avoiding him just like they always had, quirkless, contagious, a blemish on the perfection of society. Izuku couldn't breathe. He heard someone call out to him, but the voice felt like it was rippling through deep water to reach his ears. Izuku vaguely sensed a body stepping up behind him, a rasping voice in his ear, but he was drowning. It was only when an arm was thrown around his shoulder that he came back to any sliver of consciousness of his own body. Mind still hazy, in his oxygen-deprived state, he clung to the wrist that rested on his chest and spun around into the person it belonged to. He absent-mindedly noted the way the owner of the hand tucked 2 fingers into their palm as he pressed it against their chest, trapping it between both of them as he crushed himself to them. Forehead pressed forcefully against their collarbone as he shut his eyes and counted his breaths, desperate to escape the crowd. A surprised grunt shifted the chest below him, the other hand coming up to rest carefully on his upper arm with a single finger raised. 5-point quirk activation, Izuku noted automatically. Izuku then still gripped the other hand in a death grip, with both of his own trapped beneath his chin as he tried to feel his breaths and convince himself that he was breathing and that he was alive. He could still hear the crowd, muffled further now that he had a grounding point. The darkness of his closed eyelids, light blocked by the black hoodie mere centimeters from his eyes. It was soothing. Loss of a sense allowed him to focus on his body, his breathing, and ground himself back into his bones. He could distantly feel himself being guided by his grounder, legs moving of their own volition. Desperate to clear the remaining fog in his mind that had started to seep in the moment he entered the mall to meet his class, Izuku worked through his senses. He felt the rough fabric against his forehead, the dryness of the skin beneath his own fingers, and the way the hand was carefully and tightly folded to avoid touching him with 5 fingers, no matter of any sudden move that he could make. Izuku observed the way the other hand was most certainly poised for the 5th finger to fall, but unlikely to do so by accident even if he had moved unexpectedly. His legs stumbled beneath him for a second before he allowed control of them to return to his subconscious, which was responding to his grounding point's guidance. He could taste the sweet smell of sweat as he took ragged breaths in through his nose, out through his mouth, and recognized the neutral scent of a common deodorant from the large supermarket nearby. The smell of a cheap but effective laundry detergent burned in his nostrils, mixed with the unmistakable scent of somebody. He was unbelievably glad for that. His mother liked to drench her own clothes in chemicals and soak herself in perfumes. Hugs from her often felt like being enveloped by a personal care aisle, or a shop rather than a person. He missed the soft fragrance that had always seemed to follow his mother around as a child, though he wondered now if that was also a perfume, albeit of a milder kind. Izuku also noted a soft, soothing, and constant rasp of sound, too close to be from the mall's crowd. Gradually his hearing crept back in as his breath evened out and still tucked away from the crowd by the person's tall frame. At some point, the hand on his upper arm had slid around to his back, supporting his shaking form. A soft, shushing sound brushed against his ear, and he felt his body go limp of its own accord, now completely leaning on, Izuku didn't actually know who this was. Trying desperately to catch on to their words, he managed to pick up their voice from the commotion of the crowd. Honestly, you hero students can't even go to the mall without trouble. What would you have done if I hadn't just wanted to talk? Hopeless, I tell you. Absolutely hopeless. You'd be dead in minutes. They were talking nonsense, apparently. It was only when Izuku went to raise his head that he realized he'd been crying. The dark fabric was damp beneath his face, thankfully with little to no visible snot or drool. A solid surface pressed against his back, the arm now moving down to the hollow of his lower back to prevent being crushed between Izuku and the wall. He flopped back, his supporter grunting at the sudden shift in weight, their hands still tense in his grip. In an attempt to get clearer air and feeling safe to exit the safety of their chest now, he was sure that they were hidden from the crowd. Izuku had picked his head up and dropped his head back against the wall, allowing his spine to straighten slightly from its anxious hunch, and the coolness of the stone behind him soothed the heat that had risen to his face along with his tears. Izuku kept his eyes shut, absently opening the hand that wasn't his and entwining his fingers with theirs, still clutching with both hands, but now being able to feel the flutter of pulse in their fingers as they oh so gently folded over his knuckles, bar their pinky, which remained staunchly raised. Shakily exhaling through his mouth, he finally dared to open his eyes and met the gaze of his savior from the crowd. The breath whooshed from him once again as he took in the unimpressed features of Shigaraki Tomura. Words started to tumble from his mouth, incomplete mutterings in a mix of apology, accusation, fear, and confusion. Shigaraki Tomura just sighed and squeezed the hand Izuku was still holding, pressing their combined hands against Izuku's chest. We only just got you breathing again. I wouldn't recommend losing it again. At that reminder, he shut his eyes again and fought to regain his tenuous grip on his own ability to convert oxygen. There you go, just keep breathing. I think you've been doing it enough years you should be able to remember without me telling you how. Shigaraki's voice had dropped back to the soft, near coo that Izuku now realized had been the constant, soothing sound earlier, unrecognizable to the sarcastic and indignant tone from the USJ, and a moment earlier when he had reminded Izuku to get a grip. That was a rasping sound that almost instantly turned Izuku's legs to jelly. As Izuku took back a strong-gripped control on his breathing, he felt a flush of embarrassment at the effect the voice had on him. He was practically melting from the slightest hint of praise at being able to breathe no less, and Shigaraki was still slipping in insults because he was a villain. Wow, Izuku really was pathetic when it came to positive social interactions. Slowly, opening his eyes again, he finally met the man's gaze properly. He had moved slightly backwards to give Izuku space and the realization of exactly who was helping him, the hand that had been on his back now resting on his hip. Izuku only now realizing Shigaraki had been, and still was, rubbing small, reassuring circles where it lay. The villain's face was near unreadable. A tense line to his mouth, eyes focused on him, was something that if Izuku didn't know better, he would call concern, and the slightest tilt of his head, like he was a predator and Izuku was the prey. Izuku gulped. He began to say what he didn't know, but was interrupted by a 40-something-looking woman who had barged into the alcove next to them and rested a passive-aggressive hand on Shigaraki's shoulder. She yanked down his hood, and the villain scowled, eyes narrowing in what came off as threatening, but Izuku realized was probably an adjustment to the light. "Excuse me, is something the matter here?" She took in Izuku's tear-stained face and gasped slightly. Turning around and opening her mouth as if to shout for help, Izuku didn't give her a chance, though, shifting in the split second to a bright smile, which caused the woman to shove her sunglasses, which she had lowered down to get a better look at him, back up to her face. "It's all right now, ma'am. I just don't like crowds, and Tomu-chan was helping me calm down. Thanks for worrying, though." The baffled look on Shigaraki's face as the woman awkwardly smiles and leaves them in the shadowed alcove makes him giggle. It dies in his throat when the villain meets his eyes, and for a moment they stand in silence before Izuku remembers he'd been going to speak before the interruption. "Thank you," Izuku murmurs quietly. "I don't know. I can't possibly fathom why, but thank you." He's suddenly very aware of the position that they're in as Shigaraki shuffles forward and lowers his mouth to Izuku's ear. "Even heroes don't like crowds, huh?" The breath is soft against his skin, and Izuku doesn't even think about it as he drops his head onto Shigaraki's shoulder, still unable to fully support himself. He slides the hand which isn't intertwined with the villain's fingers out from between them, and his arm having cramped at being pinned too close. As he sighs and leans further forward onto the man's shoulder, His arm moves of its own accord to wrap around and tangle his fingers in the back of Shigaraki's hoodie. I never have, he admits quietly. It's easier to talk to the darkness of Shigaraki's hoodie than acknowledging a weakness to someone he knows. Not the first time I've been abandoned on a class trip, though. Just caught me off guard. Shigaraki shifts their shared grip so they have more room to breathe in the small space left between them. I was going to ask you about Stain, he rasped, the voice not as grating as Izuku had remembered or imagined it from the USJ. I don't think you did very well in your first aid class if you think it's a good idea to bring up a traumatic event after someone just had a breakdown, Izuku murmurs back, appreciating how the villain, because he is still a villain and Izuku could really do with remembering that, doesn't bring attention to the small weakness that he shared. Well, I said I was going to. I'm not going to now. I'm not that insensitive. Izuku realizes now that Shigaraki must be resting his own head on the wall above Izuku's shoulder, and it brings him some slight relief to know the villain is also using a form of support. The hand has also slid slightly further around his back. He pays it little mind. I suppose you got top marks, then. He remembers to reply, a beat too late, but with sarcasm to make up for it, sounding more feeble in spirit than he would have liked. Izuku raised his head momentarily to stare at the crowd, flowing past them like fish in a very expensive stream. He had little recollection of getting from the middle of it to this secluded alcove. No one was watching them. Anyone who may have been curious were adequately dissuaded by the woman who had checked on them earlier. Shigaraki shifted slightly on his feet, and Izuku sighed and dropped his head again. I wouldn't mind talking about Stain, he says slowly, breaking the silence. Shigaraki lets out a small grunt to show that he was listening. Just not right now. A few long moments passed before the villain realized he wasn't going to continue. Then what do you suggest? Neither of us could risk another meeting like this. Unthinkingly, Izuku rolls his head so he is resting his temple on the man's shoulder, unintentionally letting his hair tickle Shigaraki's neck and causing the villain to shiver against him with a shaky inhale catching in his throat. Izuku freezes at the movement, then flushes with embarrassment. God, he can't even do physical contact without fucking it up. Trying to ignore the villain's moment of weakness, he decides to focus on the question instead. Do you want my number? It's only when Shigaraki draws back like he's been burned that Izuku realizes exactly how what just happened could be interpreted. Stammering apologies, he desperately tried to explain. So that you can ask me about Stain. That's all. God, I didn't mean. Shigaraki's jaw is tight, and his eyes are focused determinedly on the floor, his left hand dropping from Izuku's hip. Izuku pulls his own arm back from where it had wrapped around the villain's back. In the midst of his frantic apologies and hand-waving, Izuku let go of Shigaraki's right hand, which he had been clutching throughout their encounter. After half a minute more of his frantic stuttering, Izuku fell silent and dropped his hands uselessly to his sides, gaze dropping to the floor in a mimicry of Shigaraki's own uncomfortable posture. They stood there for another long moment before the villain let out an exhausted laugh, rolled his shoulders back into a more upright posture. You're a riddle, wrapped up in a mystery, Izu-chan. The mocking lilt of the nickname made him flush harder, but he realized that Shigaraki was getting revenge for calling him Tomu-chan earlier, when the woman had interrupted them. He opened his mouth with a retort, but found he had nothing to say. Another dry chuckle emanated from the villain, who had stepped forward again, reclaiming the distance he had put between them in the moment of awkwardness. A hand slipped under his chin, and raised his head from its sad droop toward the floor. The villain stared at his face, eyes shining with a mad kind of amusement. I'll have that number now. If you don't mind, of course. Shigaraki's voice was far lower than before, and Izuku shivered involuntarily until he couldn't stand it anymore and slapped Shigaraki's hand away. He pulled out a scrap of paper from his pocket alongside the pen that he had kept for his notebooks, and he scribbled down his phone number, shoving it into Shigaraki's hand. The villain's lips twisted up at the corners, and Izuku wasn't sure what to make of the pleased gleam in his eyes. Glad to see you've still got a bit of spunk in you, the villain murmured, eyes still scanning Izuku's face. I do hate a fight without a passionate enemy. And then he was twisting away into the crowd, hood pulled back over his hair in an effortless movement, and posture slouched to blend in seamlessly with the unwitting public. A wolf in a flock of sheep, Izuku thought absently, hand coming to trace the line of his jaw, where he could still feel the dry scrape of the villain's touch. The smallest of smiles curved his lips, and he allowed himself to fully slump against the wall, pulling out his phone to text the class group chat that he was heading home before slipping into the crowd himself. A leper amongst the blessed, a quirkless amongst the quirked. All right, everyone. This concludes the one-shot entitled Breathless in a Crowd. Hope you guys like this one. This is one I reread a good bit. I like fics that take a different perspective on the mall interaction between Izuku and Shigaraki. Let me know your thoughts and reactions, and as always, thank you so much for listening.